Have you ever noticed that certain people simply vanish? Not physically. They still show up to the same meetings, the same dinners, the same group chats. But something underneath has quietly changed. They're present in body, yet some essential part of them has slipped loose from the shared game everyone else is still playing without question. They keep nodding along in conversations, but you can feel it. They've stepped back to a strange distance, watching the whole scene the way an anthropologist watches a ritual belonging to a culture that is no longer theirs. If you've ever sensed this in someone close to you, or more unsettling still, in yourself, then you've brushed up against one of the strangest and most fascinating phenomena of our time. The quiet awakening of people who have started to question the very scaffolding of our shared reality. This isn't a loud process. There are no marches, no manifestos, no dramatic breaks. It's something slower and, in its own way, far more radical. It's the moment a person realizes that a huge portion of what we call reality is actually an elaborate agreement, a structure kept alive only because almost everyone participates in it without ever really examining it. And once someone sees this clearly, something in them can't be undone. They can no longer unsee the strings running through the show. A brief history of seeing the machine. For most of human history, we lived in small, tightly bound communities where the rules were visible and the consequences were immediate. If you broke with the tribe's expectations, everyone knew it. You'd be pulled aside, argued with, shamed, maybe cast out, but crucially, the system itself was something any member could actually understand. Power was direct. Consequences arrived quickly. The purpose behind a ritual, a taboo, or a social expectation was rarely a total mystery. Then civilization scaled up and something strange happened. We built systems of coordination so vast, so layered, that no single person, not even the people supposedly running them, could hold the whole picture in their head. We now live inside stacks of abstraction on top of abstraction. Financial systems that even economists argue about. Political machinery running on logic that's often invisible to the people inside it. Global webs of production and shipping that connect a phone in your pocket to a mine on another continent. Cultural stories that quietly shape what we want, what we fear, and who we think we're supposed to become. Stories most of us never consciously chose to believe. Most people get through all this complexity by leaning on inherited scripts. We trust that someone somewhere knows what they're doing. We assume the system, taken as a whole, basically makes sense, even if we can't personally trace its logic. And most days, that's enough to get by. But every so often, something shifts in a person's mind. Maybe it's a personal crisis, a loss that strips away the noise, a long stretch of solitude, or maybe it's nothing dramatic at all. Just the slow accumulation of small contradictions that eventually become too loud to ignore. And suddenly this person starts noticing what was always there, hiding in plain sight, that so much of what we call the real world is a staggeringly elaborate, collectively maintained performance. They start to see that the entire global economy runs on shared belief in the value of pieces of paper and numbers on a screen. That political authority works only because enough people agree, mostly without saying so out loud, that it's legitimate. That their own sense of who I am is stitched together largely from narratives absorbed from the culture around them. Narratives they never sat down and chose. The strange vertigo of waking up. This first glimpse can feel euphoric, and it can feel like the floor dropping out beneath you at the same time. Imagine realizing you've spent your entire life inside an elaborate game and never once noticed it was a game. Your fears are still real. Your ambitions still matter to you. Your relationships still carry weight. But now there's a new layer of awareness hovering just above all of it, watching with a strange, cool detachment. It's a bit like waking up inside a dream and continuing to dream. Except now you know you're dreaming, and you can't quite decide whether that knowledge is a gift or a curse. What makes this particular kind of awakening especially disorienting in our era is that the systems being unveiled have grown far more sophisticated and far more invasive than anything earlier generations dealt with. Digital technology hasn't just added new social games to the pile. It has supercharged our participation in the old ones. Our social networks aren't neutral tools for staying in touch. They're intricate machines of social validation, constantly recalibrating how we see ourselves and each other. Our phones aren't simply convenient. They've become something closer to an extension of our own minds, quietly filtering nearly every interaction we have with the world. Once someone wakes up to how constructed all of this is, one of the first things they notice is exactly how their attention has been captured, engineered, really, by systems built specifically to hold it. They start noticing how their emotions get pulled and pushed by feeds tuned to reward outrage and anxiety because those feelings keep people scrolling. They notice how their desires get shaped by advertising that knows more about their habits than their closest friends do. They notice how their political views have been gently, relentlessly reinforced by information bubbles engineered to keep them comfortable and keep them clicking. Have you ever felt that odd sensation of watching your own life from somewhere just outside it? That flicker of awareness that maybe, just maybe, you've been participating in systems you never actually chose? It's uncomfortable to admit, especially in a culture that prizes the appearance of control and certainty above almost everything else. But if that feeling resonates with you even a little, you're not alone. A surprising number of people carry this same quiet unease in silence, assuming they're the only ones who feel it. The impossible choice. As this awareness deepens, the newly awakened person runs straight into a genuinely difficult dilemma. On one hand, they can't go back to playing along with the old innocence. Conversations about career ladders, status symbols, and the latest cultural trend start to feel oddly hollow, like everyone in the room is reciting lines from a script nobody remembers writing, performing a scene whose original author has long since left the building. On the other hand, simply opting out isn't a real option either. Bills still need paying, relationships still need tending, family still needs caring for. Ordinary life keeps demanding participation in the very system whose artificial scaffolding is now impossible to unsee. This tension produces a very particular flavor of alienation, one that doesn't map neatly onto older frameworks. It isn't the alienation Marx described where a worker feels cut off from the product of their own labor. It isn't existentialist alienation either, the kind that comes from staring into a universe that seems to offer no inherent meaning. It's something quieter and, in some ways, stranger. The experience of living consciously inside a shared illusion, knowing full well that it is one, and yet being unable to fully step outside it or convince the people around you that it's there at all. The gradual disappearance. People who go through this kind of awakening often undergo what might be called a slow social disappearing act. There's rarely a dramatic announcement or a clean break from their old life. Instead, they quietly recede from enthusiastic participation in games they now recognize as artificial. They stop chasing validation through the usual channels. Their presence on social media thins out. They lose interest in political arguments that now strike them as theater. Their conversations, when they do happen, tend to go deeper but happen less often. They're still there, physically present at the table, but something essential in them has stepped back from the collective performance. This shift is accelerated by something unique to our particular historical moment. Never before have ordinary people had this much access to information about how the systems governing their lives actually work under the hood. Anyone with an internet connection can read about the psychological tactics baked into advertising, the mechanics by which media outlets shape public opinion, the ways corporate money bends political outcomes, the deliberate design choices that make social apps so hard to put down. This unprecedented transparency makes it genuinely difficult to hold on to the kind of naive trust these systems quietly depend on to keep functioning smoothly. At the same time, our era has also handed us remarkably sharp conceptual tools for understanding all of this. Cognitive science has mapped out the biases that warp our perception without our even noticing. Sociology has shown, in exhaustive detail, how social structures quietly shape what feels possible to any given person. Anthropology has revealed just how culturally relative many of our most bedrock beliefs actually are. Neuroscience has begun tracing the actual mechanics by which the brain assembles our subjective sense of reality in the first place. When all of these perspectives collide inside one mind, the resulting clarity about just how constructed everyday life truly is can be almost overwhelming. When the awakening becomes its own trap. Here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. The search for authenticity, for waking up, for seeing past the illusion. That search can quietly turn into just another elaborate game. People who go through this shift often gravitate toward communities of other awakened people, hoping to finally find a space free of the old performances. And then, often to their disappointment, they discover that these communities develop their own rigid scripts, their own quiet forms of conformity, their own hierarchies based on who is considered more aware or more enlightened than whom. There's a real irony buried in here. The very act of waking up from illusion can calcify into a brand new illusion, just with different furniture. This realization tends to push people toward an even deeper layer of understanding. The uncomfortable possibility that there may be no true outside to systems of social construction at all. Maybe human consciousness, by its very nature, is a fundamentally social phenomenon that can only ever operate through shared structures of meaning. Maybe what we call awakening is really just a shift from one set of social constructions to another, potentially more refined, more self-aware, but not necessarily closer to some absolute, unconditioned truth. This can land as a kind of quiet despair. If there's no ultimate escape hatch from constructed meaning, then the dream of finally reaching bedrock reality starts to look like a mirage. But there's a strange form of liberation hiding in that same realization. If there's no pure outside to find, then the pressure to locate one finally lifts. What opens up instead is the possibility of participating more consciously and more intentionally in whichever games a person actually chooses to play. The many faces of the awakened. It's worth pausing here to notice that this awakening doesn't look the same in every person it touches. For some, it arrives through burnout, the slow-motion collapse of a career built entirely on external validation, where the applause stops landing the way it used to and the silence underneath it finally becomes audible. For others, it comes through grief, when the death of someone close strips away, almost overnight, every pretense about what actually matters and what was only ever decoration. For others still, it arrives more gently, almost academically. A slow accumulation of books read, ideas encountered, conversations had, until one day the accumulated weight of all that reading tips over into a felt, lived recognition rather than just an intellectual one. There's also a version of this awakening that arrives through travel or through simply living for an extended stretch inside a culture radically different from the one a person grew up in. Nothing dismantles the illusion that your own culture's assumptions are simply how things are, quite like discovering, firsthand, an entire society organized around a completely different set of assumptions that work just as well or sometimes better. The rituals feel different. The hierarchies feel different. The stories people tell about money, status, family, and time feel different. And once you've seen one entire coherent worldview from the outside, it becomes much harder to mistake your own for anything other than one particular arrangement among many possible ones. Whatever the doorway, the destination tends to rhyme across cases, even when the details differ enormously. There's a recognizable shape to it. First, the shock of noticing, Then the disorientation of realizing how much you'd taken for granted. Then the loneliness of seeing something most people around you haven't yet seen. And finally, for those who make it this far, some kind of settled, workable way of living with the awareness rather than being overwhelmed by it. The loneliness. Nobody warns you about one aspect of this process that rarely gets discussed openly is just how isolating it can feel in its early stages. Imagine trying to explain to a close friend over dinner that you've started to notice how much of your shared social world runs on unexamined agreement, and watching their face shift from curiosity to mild concern to gentle dismissal. Most people, quite reasonably, aren't looking for a philosophical earthquake over dinner. They're looking for connection, comfort, maybe a laugh. And the awakened person, sensing this, often learns fairly quickly to keep the bulk of these observations to themselves, which only deepens the sense of standing slightly apart from the room even while sitting inside it. This is part of why the phenomenon can look, from the outside, like withdrawal, or even mild depression, when it's often something closer to the opposite. A person becoming more clear-eyed, not less capable, even as their outward participation in certain rituals thins out. The tricky part is that clarity and connection don't automatically travel together. You can see the machinery with total clarity and still feel a very real ache at the distance it creates between you and the people you love, who may not be seeing it the same way, or at all. The good news, if there is any, is that this particular loneliness tends to soften over time. Not because the clarity fades, but because the person learns how to hold it more lightly and how to find the handful of others, however few, who are somewhere on a similar road. A single genuine conversation with someone who simply gets it, without needing everything explained from scratch, can do more for that isolation than months of trying to convince skeptical friends. When institutions notice the awakening. 2. It would be a mistake to think this shift happens only inside individual minds while the surrounding institutions stay perfectly still. Institutions notice, in their own way, when large numbers of people start disengaging from the old scripts, and they tend to respond. Sometimes that response looks like genuine adaptation. Workplaces experimenting with more flexible structures, media outlets trying, at least in part, to rebuild trust through more transparent practices. Educational programs incorporating more critical thinking rather than pure rote compliance. But just as often, the response looks like a more sophisticated repackaging of the same underlying dynamics. Wellness culture, for instance, can become just another marketplace of status, where the currency shifts from luxury goods to morning routines, meditation streaks, and the performance of having figured it out. Authenticity itself can be marketed, packaged, and sold back to the very people searching for an escape from marketing in the first place. This is part of what makes the whole territory so slippery. Even the tools built to help people see past illusion can themselves be absorbed back into the machinery, repackaged, and sold as the next version of the very game they were meant to help people step outside of. Recognizing this doesn't mean throwing up your hands and concluding that escape is impossible, or that nothing is ever what it claims to be. It means holding a certain humility about any single practice, community, or belief system that promises final liberation. The awakening described here isn't a product you can purchase once and keep forever. It has to be renewed, checked, and re-examined continually, because the systems it responds to are themselves constantly evolving, adapting, and finding new ways to absorb whatever resists them. Practical shapes. This awakening tends to take, for all its abstract, almost philosophical framing, this shift tends to show up in very concrete, everyday choices. It might look like someone quietly stepping back from a promotion track they once would have chased without a second thought, not out of laziness, but because the underlying story about what that promotion was supposed to deliver, status, security, a settled sense of having made it, no longer holds the same persuasive weight it once did. It might look like someone deleting an app or several, Not out of some grand statement about digital minimalism, but simply because they've noticed, with unusual clarity, the exact mechanism by which the app was pulling at their attention, and they'd rather keep that attention for themselves. It might look like someone finally being honest in a long relationship about a need or a fear they'd been suppressing for years in order to maintain an image of effortless togetherness. It might look like someone sitting out a political argument they would once have thrown themselves into with total conviction, not because they've stopped caring, but because they've started noticing how much of the argument's energy comes from engineered outrage rather than genuine disagreement about values. None of these choices, taken individually, look particularly dramatic from the outside. That's exactly the point. This isn't a phenomenon of grand gestures. It's a phenomenon of 1,000 small recalibrations, each one small enough to go unnoticed by everyone except the person making it. And eventually, the people close enough to notice that something in their friend, partner, or colleague has quietly shifted, becoming a conscious player. People who reach this deeper layer of understanding tend to develop a genuinely new relationship with social life. They don't disappear entirely, and they don't go back to playing along naively either. Instead, they become something closer to conscious players, engaging with the systems life still requires of them, while holding a clear, steady awareness of just how constructed those systems are. They might still pursue professional success, but without mistaking that success for their inherent worth as a person. They might still build deep, committed relationships, but without loading them down with the impossible expectations absorbed from movies and social media. They might still engage politically, but without fully merging their identity with a partisan tribe. This kind of conscious participation takes a constant, delicate balancing act. It's a bit like learning to perform a choreography where you can see every single step laid bare, the counts, the transitions, the exact mechanics of the dance, and yet somehow still finding a way to move through it with grace and even genuine joy. It requires cultivating something we might call ironic sincerity. The capacity to fully show up for the things you're doing and the people you love, while holding a light, almost playful awareness of the constructed scaffolding underneath it all. A new relationship with suffering. One of the most remarkable things about people who make it to this stage is that they often become more effective in practical life, not less. Freed from the need to prove something through external achievement, they can direct their energy toward what actually matters to them. No longer gripped by the pressure to maintain a particular image, they tend to become more honest in their relationships. And by understanding the mechanisms of influence operating around them, they can make far more deliberate choices about where their attention and effort actually go. But maybe the most significant shift of all is in how this awakening reshapes a person's relationship with their own suffering. Once you understand that a large share of your pain comes from straining to meet expectations planted in your mind by systems you were never even fully aware of, a real kind of relief becomes available. Not every problem disappears, far from it, but the character of suffering itself changes. Instead of something that simply happens to you, it becomes something you can observe, something you can begin to understand from a slight remove rather than being entirely swallowed by it. When enough people wake up together. This shift in the relationship to suffering has implications that reach well past any one individual. When enough people in a society begin waking up in this way, the wider social structure itself starts to bend. Systems that depend on mass unconscious participation start to lose their grip. New forms of organizing collective life become genuinely possible. New ways of relating to technology, to work, to consumption, and to each other start to emerge, sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once. We may already be seeing early signs of this shift playing out around us. The growing popularity of mindfulness practices, the rising hunger for a life with actual purpose rather than just accumulation, the renewed interest in contemplative traditions, the steady climb in interest around philosophy and psychology as tools for living rather than just academic subjects. All of this can be read as symptoms of a slow, collective stirring. Even the surge of interest in conspiracy theories, however distorted or misdirected much of it turns out to be, may reflect a correct underlying instinct. that there really are layers of reality that usually stay hidden from view, and that something in the official story often doesn't add up. The instinct is often right, even when the specific explanation people land on is wrong. But this collective stirring also creates genuinely new challenges for society as a whole. Economic systems built around status-driven consumption may start to wobble once a critical mass of people stop finding meaning in acquiring things. Political systems that run on emotional mobilization may lose their pull as more people become aware of exactly how their emotions are being engineered in real time. Educational structures designed in large part to produce compliant workers may need a genuine overhaul once students start questioning the very values they're being trained to absorb. The machines that are better than us at being us, artificial intelligence, adds an entirely new layer of complexity to all of this. As machines become capable of handling more and more of the cognitive work that used to define human labor, we're forced to confront a deeper question, not just how we organize our economy and society, but what it actually means to be human in the first place. If so much of what we once considered distinctly human can be replicated, or at least closely imitated, by an algorithm, then what unique role is left for conscious human beings to play? This question becomes sharper still when you consider that the very same technologies capable of replacing us at certain tasks are also remarkably good at shaping what we think, feel, and want in the first place. We are, in effect, building systems that don't just perform tasks better than we do, some of them are becoming better than we are at persuading us what to believe. In a world like that, the ability to hold on to a genuinely critical awareness of our own mental experience, to notice when our attention, our emotions, or our beliefs are being nudged by something outside ourselves, may be one of the last distinctly human advantages left standing. Which part of this unfolding future unsettles you the most? Is it the thought of machines quietly reshaping what we believe? The slow hollowing out of old economic and political stories that no longer hold together the way they used to? Or something closer to home, the question of what it actually means to hold on to your own humanity in a world of increasingly intelligent, increasingly persuasive machines? It's worth sitting with that question for a while, not to solve it in a single sitting, but to notice, honestly, which part of it keeps you up at night, and to recognize that if it does, you're almost certainly not the only one. The body remembers what the mind forgets. There's a dimension to this awakening that often gets overlooked in purely intellectual discussions of it, the body's role in the whole process. Long before the mind has fully articulated what's changing, the body often already knows. A tightness in the chest during a meeting that used to feel routine. A wave of exhaustion after scrolling through a feed that used to feel merely entertaining. A strange heaviness settling in during a conversation about achievement or status that used to feel exciting and now just feels tiring. This somatic dimension matters because it suggests the awakening isn't purely a cognitive event, a matter of collecting the right facts or reading the right books, but something closer to a full nervous system recalibration. The body, in its own quiet way, starts refusing to cooperate with performances it once managed effortlessly. Sleep patterns shift. Appetite for certain kinds of stimulation, noise, spectacle, drama begins to fade, sometimes replaced by a new hunger for stillness, silence, or simple repetitive tasks that ask nothing of the performing self. People who pay attention to this bodily dimension often find the transition easier to navigate than those who try to reason their way through it purely at the level of ideas. The body, after all, has its own form of intelligence about what actually nourishes it and what merely depletes it, even when the mind is still busy constructing elaborate justifications for staying in a role that no longer fits. The role of language in keeping the game going. Language deserves special attention in any honest account of how these systems maintain themselves, because so much of the machinery runs quite literally on words. The specific vocabulary we're handed to describe our lives. Words